Introductory note. Henry Fielding, an English novelist, dramatist, and essayist, born at Sharpham Park, near Glastonbury, Somersetshire, April 22, 1707, died at Lisbon, October 8, 1754. He was of an ancient family which could trace its descent from the same stock as the imperial house of Habsburg. After distinguishing himself at Eton, he was sent to the University of Leiden, but he led so expensive a life that his not over-rich father was obliged to recall him in his 20th year. His father promised him an allowance of £200 a year, which, said Fielding, anybody might pay who would. He took up his residence in London, and began writing for the stage, his first comedy, Love in Several Masks, being produced while he was yet a minor. In his 27th year he married Miss Craddock, who had a fortune of only £1,500. He retired to a small estate worth about £200 a year which he had inherited from his mother, resolving to amend his loose way of life. He gave up writing for the stage, and applied himself closely to literary studies. But his income was insufficient for his profuse expenses, and in 3 years he fell into bankruptcy. He went back to London, entered himself as a student at the Inner Temple, and in due time was called to the bar. But repeated attacks of gout prevented him from traveling the circuit, and compelled him to fall back to his pen for support. He wrote comedies and farces for the theatre, essays, poems, and squibs for periodicals, and even produced an elaborate treatise on Crown Law. The entire number of his dramatic pieces was about 30, but the only ones which have kept the stage are his burlesque Tom Thumb the Great, produced at 23, and The Miser, an adaptation from the French, 3 years later. Fielding did not discover wherein his true strength lay until he had reached the age of 34, when, in 1742, appeared his first novel, Joseph Andrews, which was begun as a burlesque upon Richardson's Pamela, but which grew into something of a far higher order. Shortly after the publication of this novel his wife died. He was sincerely attached to her, and mourned her deeply, but in a few months he consoled himself by marrying her maid. In 1743 he put forth 3 volumes of miscellanies, including The Journey from This World to the Next, and soon after the great prose satire, The History of Jonathan Wild. In 1749 appeared the second of his novels, and the best of all, Tom Jones, or The History of a Foundling, which some have styled the greatest of all compositions of its class. He had by his pen done good service to the Whig party of his day, and in 1749, when his constitution had completely broken down, he received the appointment of acting magistrate for Westminster. The emoluments of this office were small, and the duties, which were not onerous, seem to have been performed with great ability. In 1752 was published his third novel, The History of Amelia, in which he attempts to portray the virtues of his first wife and the reckless conduct of his own early years. His health gave way wholly, dropsy, with which he had long been troubled, assumed an aggravated form. He was induced to make a voyage to Portugal, in the hope of being benefited by a milder climate. He sailed in the summer of 1754, but died in 2 months after reaching Lisbon. Few authors have been so warmly praised by famous critics as Fielding has been. Perhaps the most genial of all of these eulogies is pronounced by Thackeray in his English Humorists of the 18th century.